Have you ever heard a story that's just too good to be true? Well, let me tell you about one of the biggest, most mind-bending mysteries of the last 100 years. This is the story of Anastasia Romanov, the youngest daughter of the last Tsar of Russia. The official story is grim. The entire Romanov family was executed, but almost immediately, whispers started. What if Anastasia survived? It became a global phenomenon. The mystery of Anastasia captured the world's imagination because it offered a tiny glimmer of hope in a very dark story. Did Anastasia actually survive? That's what we're going to dive into. We'll look at the facts, the fictions, and the science. Let's get to the bottom of what really happened to Anastasia. How did the rumor start? It began in the confusion after the revolution. The Bolsheviks were cagey about what happened to the Romanovs. At first, they announced only the Tsar's death, creating a vacuum of information. People wondered about the rest of the family. The bodies couldn't be found, and without proof, anything seemed possible. Stories popped up all over Europe. The legend was fueled by the political situation and the Romanov fortune stashed in foreign banks. Suddenly, there was a financial incentive for someone to be Anastasia. The whisper became a global headline, a full-blown legend. The world was divided between skeptics and believers. The stage was set for a compelling identity puzzle. Why did this story become so famous? It speaks to something deep inside all of us. We love stories about underdogs who triumph over evil. Anastasia's story was the ultimate underdog tale. She represented innocence lost in a world of violence. She loved to play pranks and make people laugh. She had a spark. Then Hollywood got involved, cementing the legend in popular culture. The most famous example is the 1997 animated movie. For millions, this became the definitive version of the story. It wasn't history, it was a fairy tale we all fell in love with. The story of Anastasia is more than just a mystery. It's about memory, identity, and the power of hope. It shows how a tragedy can transform into an enduring legend. Let's rewind. Who were the Romanovs? Imagine unbelievable luxury. The Alexander Palace outside St. Petersburg was home for Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children. It was their private world. They had hundreds of servants and a personal train. Nicholas and Alexandra were deeply in love and preferred a quiet family life. They were incredibly tight-knit. The Tsar was a gentleman, not cut out to rule a massive empire. The Tsarina, Alexandra, was German-born and deeply religious. She was intensely protective of her son, Alexei, who suffered from a terrible illness. They were often cut off from the real world. Life inside was a mix of opulence and simplicity. They were a family living on another planet compared to most Russians. This isolation would become their fatal flaw. Russia was groaning under the weight of poverty and war. Their perfect family bubble was about to burst. Let's meet the Romanov children. 4 girls known as Otma, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their little brother Alexei. The sisters shared everything and were best friends. Olga was serious, Tatiana elegant, Maria kind, and Anastasia, the mischievous family clown. Alexei, the Tsarevich, was the heir to the throne, but he suffered from hemophilia. This led the family to Rasputin, a mystic who seemed to help Alexei, but whose influence caused scandal and damaged the Romanovs' reputation. Ultimately, their reliance on Rasputin contributed to the dynasty's downfall. As the Romanov children lived in luxury, Russia was boiling with unrest. The empire was vast, but most people were poor peasants barely scraping by. Industrialization brought a new, suffering working class. Discontent grew. People demanded change and began to organize. Then World War I erupted in 1914. At first, patriotism surged. Nicholas led the army, but his absence left a power vacuum. Tsarina Alexandra and Rasputin filled it, fueling suspicion and anger. The war was a disaster, millions dead, cities starving, the economy in ruins. The people blamed the Tsar. Revolution was inevitable. In early 1917, protests exploded in Petrograd. Soldiers joined the crowds. Authority collapsed. Nicholas, isolated, realized too late it was over. The Romanov dynasty, after 3 centuries, was teetering on the edge. The storm had finally broken. March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. The family became prisoners in their own palace, watched by armed guards. Hopes for exile faded as Russia's chaos deepened. The children, once royal, were now captives. In August, the family was moved to Tobolsk, Siberia, far from home, stripped of luxury. They tried to keep routines, but the world outside was changing fast. The Bolsheviks seized power in October, tightening control. Guards grew harsher, freedoms vanished. The House of Freedom became the House of Imprisonment. The family's fate was sealed. The final act was about to begin. In spring 1918, the Romanovs were moved to Yekaterinburg's Ipatiev House, now the House of Special Purpose. High fences, painted windows, and harsh guards made it a true prison. The family was confined, their old life gone. They clung to routines, reading, needlework, games. Anastasia still tried to make them laugh. Outside, civil war raged. The White Army drew near. For the Bolsheviks, the Romanovs were a dangerous symbol. Rescue was possible, but so was disaster. Moscow decided the Romanov problem needed a permanent solution. The family's world shrank to a few rooms in constant fear. The end was closing in. The House of Special Purpose would live up to its name. The final decision was made. July 16, 1918, the Romanovs' last night. Guards woke them, claiming they'd be moved for safety. Led to a basement, the family was told to pose for a photograph. They stood together, confused and exhausted. Suddenly, armed men entered, blocking escape. Yurovsky read a brief sentence. They were to be executed. Nicholas, stunned, barely had time to react. The order was given. Gunfire erupted in the cramped room. The family's final moments were chaos and terror. No photograph was ever taken. The Romanov story ended in darkness. The world would soon learn of their fate. The execution was brutal and chaotic. Nicholas was shot first. The rest followed in a storm of bullets. Smoke and screams filled the room. Some daughters and Alexei survived the first volley. Hidden jewels in their clothes acted as armor. The killers, panicked, used bayonets and pistols to finish the job. The ordeal dragged on, far longer than planned. The jewels meant to save them only prolonged their suffering. At last, all were dead. 11 bodies on the blood-soaked floor. The House of Special Purpose had fulfilled its grim role. The Romanov dynasty was gone. Or so it seemed. The horror of that night would echo for decades. But the story wasn't quite over. The killers rushed to hide the evidence. Bodies were wrapped, loaded onto a truck, and driven to a forest. The first burial plan failed. The mine shaft was too shallow. In desperation, they buried the bodies under a muddy road, dousing them with acid and burning two separately. The grave was hastily concealed. Days later, the White Army arrived and found only clues, no bodies. The missing remains sparked rumors. Had someone survived? Whispers spread. Maybe Anastasia escaped. The mystery of the Romanovs' fate gripped the world. For 70 years, legends grew. The truth was hidden beneath the Russian earth. The Romanovs were gone, but their story refused to die. The legend had just begun. The missing bodies and Bolshevik secrecy fueled a legend. After the revolution, Europe was flooded with Russian exiles. They had lost everything and gathered in cities, clinging to the hope that someone from the imperial family had survived. This hope, combined with rumors and the Romanov fortune, created a tempting opportunity. Women started claiming to be Grand Duchesses. Some were delusional, others were fraudsters. It became a sad circus of lost identities. Each claimant had supporters who desperately wanted to believe, overlooking inconsistencies. Surviving Romanov relatives were bombarded with requests to meet these supposed survivors. The stage was set for an epic mystery. Now let's get to the main event, the most famous and controversial claimant of them all. Her story begins in Berlin in 1920. A young woman attempts suicide by jumping into a canal and is taken to a mental hospital. She has no identification and refuses to give her name. Another patient noticed a resemblance between her and the Grand Duchess Tatiana. She eventually claimed she was Anastasia, rescued by a soldier. This woman, Anna Anderson, was utterly compelling. She had an uncanny physical resemblance to Anastasia and seemed to know things only the imperial family could know. Many Romanov servants and friends were convinced she was Anastasia, but others were certain she was a fraud, pointing out she couldn't speak Russian. The battle over Anna Anderson's identity had begun. As the debate raged, a private investigator hired by Grand Duke Ernest Louis, entered the story to prove or disprove Anna's claim. The investigation suggested Anna was not Anastasia, but Franziska Shanskowska, a factory worker with a history of mental illness. This threw everything into chaos. Anna's supporters rejected this, claiming it was a lie to deny Anastasia her birthright, perhaps to hide a dark secret. Two narratives emerged: a princess reclaiming her identity, or a delusional factory worker lost in fantasy. Anna stuck to her story, insisting she was Anastasia. The world had to decide which story to believe, and the battle moved to the courtroom. The fight over Anna Anderson's identity and the Romanov fortune eventually landed in the German courts. This wasn't just a quick trial, it was one of the longest-running legal battles in German history. It started in 1938, and with various interruptions and appeals, dragged on for decades, finally ending in 1970. That's over 30 years of lawyers, witnesses, and evidence. The goal was simple: to get the court to legally declare that Anna Anderson was Grand Duchess Anastasia. If she won, she would not only have her name back, but would also have a claim to any remaining Romanov assets. The court proceedings were like something out of a movie. On one side, you had Anna's legal team, bringing in a stream of witnesses who had known the imperial family. These people, many of them old and frail, would offer emotional testimony. They would talk about how Anna had the same way of walking as Anastasia, or how she recalled a specific childhood game. They presented handwriting experts and anthropologists who argued for the similarities between Anna and the real princess. Their case was built on memory, emotion, and a powerful narrative of survival that many people found deeply moving and convincing. On the other side, the lawyers representing the remaining Romanov relatives presented their own witnesses and evidence. They brought in the people who had met Anna and declared her a fake. They focused on the things she got wrong, the historical details she couldn't remember. They brought forward members of the Shanskowska family who identified Anna as their missing relative, Franziska. They highlighted the fact she couldn't speak Russian and pointed to her peasant-like manners. Their case was built on hard facts, inconsistencies, and the testimony of those who refused to be swayed by the romantic story. After decades of arguments, the final verdict came in 1970. And what did the court decide? Well, basically they decided nothing. The court concluded that the evidence was not sufficient to prove that Anna Anderson was Anastasia Romanov. But, crucially, they also said that the evidence was not sufficient to prove she wasn't Anastasia. It was a legal stalemate. She hadn't won, but she hadn't exactly lost either. The court couldn't disprove her claim. For her supporters, this was a victory of sorts. It meant the mystery lived on. For her detractors, it was a failure to provide any real proof. The longest court case in German history had failed to solve the puzzle. While Anna Anderson was the star, she wasn't the only one claiming to be a lost Romanov. Eugenia Smith wrote a book in the 60s, claiming to be Anastasia, but was dismissed as a fraud. Others claimed to be the other sisters, like Marga Boots, who claimed to be Olga. What these claimants had in common was a story of miraculous escape from the basement in Yekaterinburg, rescued by a compassionate guard. These stories tapped into a powerful archetype, the damsel in distress saved by a secret hero. The fact that so many women told variations of this story shows how much the world wanted to believe it. Without the bodies, there was no final proof of death, creating space for myth to flourish. They were living symbols of hope, keeping the Romanov mystery alive. But a new era of science was dawning, promising to finally provide the answers. For 70 years, the story was all about imposters and rumors. But that was about to change. In 1979, two amateur historians, a geologist and a filmmaker, were obsessed with the mystery. They secretly studied the execution commander Yurovsky's private notes, which contained a chilling description of the burial. Following the clues, they started their own covert investigation. They spent their weekends digging in the forest, searching for the spot Yurovsky described. After years of searching, their spades finally hit something. It was bone. They uncovered a mass grave filled with skeletons. The skulls showed clear evidence of gunshot wounds. They reburied the remains and waited for Russia to change. That change came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. They led the Russian authorities to the spot. There were 9 skeletons in total. But wait a minute, where were the other 2? So the authorities have 9 skeletons. The big question is, are they really the Romanovs? Eyewitness accounts and historical notes are one thing, but now it was time for science to have its say. This was the early 1990s, the dawn of a new and powerful technology, DNA testing. It was like a magic tool that could solve historical mysteries. Scientists from Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States all got involved in what would become one of the most high-profile forensic cases in history. They took small samples of bone from the skeletons and set to work, trying to unlock the genetic secrets held within them. The process was incredible. To prove the skeletons belonged to the Romanovs, they needed to compare their DNA to a known relative. Luckily, they had a perfect candidate, Prince Philip, the late husband of Queen Elizabeth II. His maternal grandmother was the sister of Tsarina Alexandra. This meant he shared a specific type of DNA, mitochondrial DNA, with the Tsarina and her children. Prince Philip graciously provided a blood sample. The scientists extracted the DNA from the skeletons and from the prince. They laid the genetic codes side by side. It was the moment of truth. The results came back and they were conclusive. The DNA from the skeleton of the adult woman matched Prince Philip's perfectly. This was Tsarina Alexandra. The DNA from the 3 female children's skeletons also matched. These were 3 of the Grand Duchesses, and the DNA from the adult male skeleton. To confirm it was the Tsar, they needed a sample from his side of the family. They managed to get a sample from a descendant of Nicholas's sister. Again, a perfect match. Science had proven beyond any doubt that these were the remains of the Tsar, the Tsarina, and 3 of their daughters. But what about Anna Anderson, the woman who had claimed to be Anastasia for over 60 years? She had died in 1984, but a small tissue sample had been preserved in a hospital. Now scientists could finally put her claim to the ultimate test. They compared her DNA to the Romanov DNA from the grave and to the sample from Prince Philip. The result, not even close. There was absolutely no genetic link between Anna Anderson and the imperial family. The mystery that had fueled books, movies, and a decades-long court case was solved in a laboratory. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia. Science had spoken. The DNA tests had solved one part of the puzzle, but, they had created another. Who were the 2 missing bodies? Yurovsky's report mentioned that 11 people were killed. The grave contained the Tsar, the Tsarina, their doctor, and 3 servants, making 6. And it contained 3 of the daughters. That made 9. But there should have been 4 daughters and 1 son. This meant that the bodies of one of the daughters and the young Tsarevich, Alexei, were not in the main grave. This was huge. For a moment, the old rumors sparked back to life. Could they have escaped after all? The scientists went back to the bones to try and figure out which daughter was missing. Using computer modeling and skeletal analysis, they tried to identify each of the 3 daughters found in the grave. Based on their height and bone development, they identified the remains of Olga, the eldest, and Tatiana. The 3rd daughter was trickier. For a long time, the Russian scientists believed the missing daughter was Maria. American scientists, however, argued that the skeleton was too small to be Maria, and that it must be Anastasia who was missing from the grave. This disagreement kept the debate alive. This confusion was exactly what the believers in the Anastasia myth had been waiting for. They seized on the uncertainty. See, they said, the scientists admit Anastasia's body is missing. She must have survived. The fact that Anna Anderson had been proven a fraud didn't matter to them anymore. The official scientific report had left the door open just a crack, and that was all they needed. The legend of the survivor, which had been seemingly put to rest by DNA, was suddenly back on the table. The absence of 2 bodies from the grave was the last great hope for those who wanted to believe in a miracle. But the historians and scientists urged caution. They pointed back to Yurovsky's secret report. Remember what he wrote? He described burning 2 of the bodies separately from the others before burying them. He specifically mentioned burning the bodies of Alexei and one of the girls. The scientific evidence of 9 bodies in the main grave actually lined up perfectly with the killer's own account. The question wasn't if they had survived, but where their remains were buried. The final chapter of the search wasn't for a living person, but for a second, smaller grave somewhere in the vast Russian forest. For years, the search for the second grave continued. Amateur archaeologists and professional historians scoured the area, hoping to find the final resting place of Alexei and his sister. It seemed like a hopeless task. The forest was huge, and the killers had tried their best to hide their tracks. But just like before, it was a group of dedicated local enthusiasts who refused to give up. They returned to Yurovsky's notes, rereading every line, trying to decipher every clue about the location. Then, in the summer of 2007, nearly 90 years after the execution, they found it. In a wooded area not far from the first grave, they uncovered a small patch of burned earth. Digging carefully, they found exactly what they were looking for: 44 small, charred bone fragments. They were clearly human, and they belonged to 2 young people. One was an adolescent boy and the other was a young woman. Along with the bones, they found pieces of a sulfuric acid container and nails from a wooden box. It was all there, just as Yurovsky had described. Once again, the bone fragments were sent for sophisticated DNA analysis. The technology had advanced even further, allowing scientists to extract DNA from these badly burned remains. They compared the DNA to the genetic profile of Tsar Nicholas II. The results were undeniable. The bones from the boy were a perfect match for a son of the Tsar. This was Alexei. The bones from the young woman were a perfect match for a daughter of the Tsar. The final pieces of the puzzle had been found. So, which sister was it? The DNA tests on these final remains finally settled the old debate. The scientists confirmed that the body missing from the first grave was Maria. This meant that Anastasia's remains had been in the first grave all along. She had not survived. She had died in that basement with the rest of her family. After almost a century of myths, imposters, and speculation, science had provided the definitive answer. The story was over. The last Romanov secret had been exposed. So there you have it. After nearly a century of whispers and wild theories, we have our answer. Did Anastasia survive? The science is clear. The answer is no. The discovery of the first grave in 1991 and the final pieces in 2007 closed the book on one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries. The DNA doesn't lie. Every member of the Romanov family died together in that cold, dark basement in Yekaterinburg on that terrible July night in 1918. The story of a miraculous escape was just that, a story. The myth was finally separated from the fact. We now know that Anna Anderson was not the lost princess, but almost certainly the tragic figure of Franziska Shanskowska. She was the most famous and compelling of the imposters, but she was an imposter nonetheless. The truth is far more brutal and less romantic than the legend we wanted to believe. It's a powerful testament to how science can illuminate the darkest corners of history. The historical record is now complete. The Romanov story did not have a secret happy ending. It ended in that forest near Yekaterinburg, a tragic conclusion to a family's life and an empire's reign. Why are we still so fascinated by Anastasia? It's because the story of Anastasia has become more than just a historical question. It has transformed into a modern myth. The legend has become more powerful than the reality. The idea of the lost princess speaks to a deep human need for hope. The story of Anastasia also serves as a powerful human lens through which to view a massive, complicated historical event. It allows us to connect with history on an emotional level. Anastasia is a symbol of all innocence lost to the brutal forces of war and political extremism. The animated movie cemented this fairy tale version in the minds of millions. The fiction has become more culturally significant than the historical fact. It's a reminder that we often prefer a beautiful lie to an ugly truth. The lost princess may be gone, but the ghost of her story will likely continue to haunt and fascinate us for generations to come.